Lieutenant Colonel, may I ask you to introduce yourself and please take it away.
Okay, well, thank you, Rabbi Grossman. My name is Art Zeidman. I'm a retired Lieutenant Colonel, Army Reserve JAG, Judge Advocate General's Corps, and I served on active duty from 1978 to 1981, and then reserve duty from 1981 to 2006. Just so happened that my mandatory release date was Erev Yom Kippur. Just worked out that way. 1 October 2006. And I was mobilized twice, a few months for Desert Storm, and then a year for the Iraq War, but I never served overseas at all. Never went overseas on any official duty. The way the luck of the draw went, as I was telling Jeffrey beforehand, that I was with units that deployed people overseas, and I managed to get stuck stateside, for better or for worse. I'm in Las Vegas, Nevada, and I'm active with the Olive Institute. Sometimes I hear from soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines who have matters of legal issues, and I try to help them as best I can, although I won't actively represent service members. I have a full-time civilian job. But if anybody needs any recommendations, if you know folks who are in trouble because of their a conflict between military practice and religious observance, or even just a Jewish service member who needs some advice on a disciplinary matter or administrative matter, Rabbi Estrin at Olive will give me the person's contact, and I can speak with them confidentially. So I've been practicing law since 1978 when I started with the Army, and I've done a bunch of things in the civilian world. And when I started in the military, I was not religiously observant, and I didn't wear a yarmulke. I had the glove compartment yarmulke that you would keep in your car when you would go to a synagogue or maybe a shiva call, and you'd put it on, and that's where I was. By the mid 90s, I was wearing a yarmulke all the time, and fortunately for me, the yarmulke in the military issue had already been resolved in favor of allowing yarmulkes in most circumstances. But our subject today is the legal history, modern legal history of wearing yarmulkes in service. So, Rabbi Grossman, without further ado, I'll launch into my opening remarks, and then be glad to open the door for discussion, questions, comments, personal experiences, war stories, and peace stories. Okay.
Thank you very much. Take it away.
All right, thank you. So I actually wrote a paper about this recently, so if you'll apologize, I'm going to use it as my crib notes because it gets a little complicated, and I'll try to keep it from being too legalistic. Up until the 1980s, the issue of wearing a yarmulke or a whole host of religious headgear, religious ornaments, religious garments was really not well defined. And by the time Rabbi Goldman came along, Rabbi Simcha Goldman, things weren't all that clear legally. If you looked at the regulations from each of the services, it didn't say anything about religious headgear. It didn't say anything about exemptions. The regulations pertaining to uniforms. In the Army, it's AR 670-1. But in any event, so Rabbi Goldman was an Air Force Reserve officer. And he had been on active duty in the Air Force as a psychologist. And he wore a yarmulke for many years and no one objected. It was the 70s and the 80s. And he was an ordained rabbi, but again, his role was as a medical service officer, psychologist, or medical officer. I think psychologists are medical service. But in any event, he was called as a witness in a court-martial criminal trial in the Air Force. And he testified on behalf of an accused, a defendant in a court-martial. And the prosecutor brought court-martial charges against Rabbi Goldman, I think he was a captain at the time, for violating Air Force Reg 35-10, which prohibited the wear of headgear with a uniform indoors. Now, if you're not familiar with it, the military custom is to remove your hat when you go indoors. And when I was a kid in public school, teacher stood at the doorway and made sure every boy took his hat off as he walked into the building. And the Air Force regulation said you couldn't wear uniform headgear with a uniform, with certain exceptions, like carrying a weapon. You didn't have to use a hand to take off the headgear. Certain ceremonial events, such as color guard. The interesting backdrop is that Rabbi Goldman had been a Navy chaplain in the early 70s, active duty Navy chaplain, and wore a yarmulke all the time without any problem. And that was for 2 years during his draft tour. But he came back to the Air Force as a psychologist. And as I said, for several years, his wear of the yarmulke was overlooked or tolerated until he testified in this case. So he was ordered by his commander to remove the yarmulke, and he refused, and he got a letter of reprimand. The court-martial charges didn't go anywhere, but the letter of reprimand stuck. And of course, that can be death to an officer's career. So he sued the Department of Defense to remove the letter of reprimand and to restore his good name in the service. Well, case went to the U.S. Supreme Court. It was at the time in the 1980s that the court was still fairly liberal as a left or right-wing body. And the U.S. Supreme Court ruled against him and said that he did not have a right to wear a yarmulke in service. And one of the reasons they gave was military necessity, that they had to uphold the Air Force rules prohibiting beards, yarmulkes, all those things as part of the grooming standards, which were important for reasons that were known to the Air Force, and that the courts wouldn't intervene in things like military necessity and the executive branch, the president's right to control the military. And as a result of that, the law was established and remains actually to this day that you have no constitutional right under the First Amendment to wear a yarmulke or beard for that matter, but a yarmulke was the issue in the United States military. So there was a bit of an uproar, and Senator Lautenberg, Oliver Sholem, who was a senator from New Jersey, offered an amendment to the 1988 National Defense Authorization Act, and that amendment became called the Lautenberg Amendment. Now, there were other amendments which Lautenberg authored for other issues. So if you hear the word Lautenberg Amendment, it might actually pertain to something else because he did a bunch of amendments. But the Lautenberg Amendment, which passed Congress and was signed into law by President Reagan, allowed the wear of modest religious gear while in uniform. It was only pertaining to yarmulkes, didn't apply to other religious practices. So it was just yarmulkes. It also allowed other forms of religious wear, for example, crosses or various other insignia. The rule on the wear of the yarmulke, starting with the 1988 NDAA, was that the item had to be modest. So it had to be subtle, discreet, and couldn't interfere with the wear of other items in the uniform. Now, what was interesting is that there had been a rule pertaining to beards in the uniform regulation of the Army, which also had an exception for Sikhs to wear turbans.
I remember that.
Remember that?
Yeah.
And that was phased out. The beards were allowed for religious purposes, and the turbans were allowed for religious purposes. And when I first went into the Army, AR 670-1 actually had depictions of soldiers in various uniforms, Class A, Class B, Class C, with turbans. Not with yarmulkes, but it showed the turbans, and they were very modest turbans. When that was eliminated, it had a grandfather clause, which continues to this day, that those who had beards and turbans prior to the effective date, which I think was sometime in the 1980s, could continue to do it throughout their career. So this is a side note, since we're talking about yarmulkes and not beards and turbans. But in one of my last assignments in 2005 or 2006, I had to go to an inspection of my reserve unit at Mare Island Naval Station in Vallejo, California. And there was a Colonel Khalsa who was there with a turban and his BDUs. And a very interesting guy, because he had blue eyes and blonde hair and looked more European than I did. But his last name, Khalsa, is a Sikh name, Khalsa. But in any event, it was the first time I'd ever seen anyone in uniform actually wearing a turban from the United States. I'd seen it from other countries. But in any event, so the Lautenberg Amendment went into effect, and yarmulkes were and are legal. Now, let's talk about what that means. I'm wearing a yarmulke here, big black yarmulke, and when I was in reserve duty or active duty, starting in the mid-90s, when I started to wear a yarmulke with my uniform, I'd wear a small, the little silver dollar size things. Actually, I'm exaggerating, but pretty small, with the Velcro, so it would fit under my uniform cap. If I wore the big saucer cap, I could wear any size yarmulke I wanted, because it, goes like this. But with the baseball cap, and even worse was the flat cap, which they used to have, or the beret, a big old yarmulke would stick out on the sides. So I used to wear a much smaller yarmulke because the regulation required that it didn't interfere with the uniform itself. And I took that personally to mean that it couldn't be seen as extraneous. Now, I have seen people wear larger yarmulkes. I'm not sure that that's been fully interpreted. But in any event, the wear of yarmulkes was allowed. Now, could you wear a pink polka dot yarmulke that says, I support Chuck Schumer on it? No, it has to be something modest. That's the important thing. So typically it was monochromal, one color. And most soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines who have been wearing yarmulkes have picked either black or a color that goes along with the color of the uniform, let's say a matching Air Force blue or navy white. And of course, what's popular with the fatigues is wearing the fatigue yarmulke, which is sort of neat to see people do that. However, that was the only exception. So the wear of the yarmulke was allowed. Now, what happens if you are in a situation where the wear of the yarmulke could potentially interfere with duty? Let's talk about those scenarios. The first one that always comes up is the same as the beard scenario. It has to do with gas masks, with helmets, with other maybe flight caps. And I've talked to Air Force pilots who were observant, who say that if no one's looking, they'll wear a little yarmulke under their flight cap. And the reason they do that is it's an interesting one. And those of you who are really strictly observant will understand this, that, you know, like most things Jewish, it's not enough to just do something. We have to do it to an extreme sometimes. So just as you might double wrap food in aluminum foil to heat it up and keep it kosher in a non-kosher oven, well, we double wrap our heads when davening. And while you might wear a yarmulke all the time, some people have a custom, especially Hasidim, but also some others, to wear a hat or a second covering over the yarmulke. I'll let Rabbi Grossman explain some of the reasoning for that. I do it, but never fully understood. And so I've talked to some pilots who are observed wearing yarmulkes, and if no one sees them put it on, they leave the yarmulke on and put their flight cap over it. And if it's a nice thin yarmulke, no one knows the better. And the reason they do that is because when they're in the air, they might want to daven. If it's going to be mincha or mariv, and they're not going to have a chance to daven, so they want to have two head coverings. That's really not covered by the Lautenberg Amendment. And if they are discovered doing that and someone objects, could be a problem. And of course, we know that the yarmulke itself has no holy religious significance. You know, if you see sometimes people have if they drop a sitter on the ground, they'll pick it up and kiss it. And I've seen people do that many times. If they drop a yarmulke on the ground, they'll pick it up and kiss it. Well, it's not. It doesn't have God's name on it or in it, or shouldn't, I guess. And it is an article of clothing, like a tie. But so it doesn't have the same religious significance. And why is that important? Because you can just wear a hat and not wear a yarmulke and be covered for keeping your head covered from a halachic perspective, from a religious requirement. However, wearing the yarmulke is also a statement of pride for some people. While some people feel that they don't want to stand out and show that there's anything unusual going on, such as religious observance, other people want everybody to know, look, I'm wearing the yarmulke, especially doing outreach to other Jews, saying, hey, it's okay to be Jewish here at Camp Swampy. I'm just like you. Even if the person is not observant, they see the person with the yarmulke and feel a sense of connection that maybe encourages them, especially if there's a small number of Jewish personnel at the base. But in any event, from a halachic standpoint, from a religious standpoint, one can keep his head covered with a head covering. It doesn't have to be a yarmulke. It's just a convenient thing because it doesn't take up a lot of room, doesn't take too much styling, and is inexpensive. So, and the issue about gas masks. Also, the issue is, even in an indoor office environment in the military, are you doing something that's so active that the yarmulke will interfere? And there should be no head covering. So there's also another issue about swimming. And so my understanding of religious law is that when you are swimming, you can take off the yarmulke. If you can wear a cap, that's fine, but it's not a requirement. Just like taking a shower, you don't have to take a shower with your yarmulke on. So what do you do if you're in SEAL training and you're in the water 12 hours and you're going to be in and out back and forth? What do you do with the yarmulke? Well, I don't have an answer for that. Maybe somebody else on the call will. But strictly as a matter of the Lautenberg Amendment and the rights that we have under it, it wouldn't be covered, because the argument would be still that military necessity might arguably not allow you to wear a yarmulke in that environment. And of course, there's space travel and everything else. So that brings us to a couple other laws. We have the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which was enacted in the 1990s, which actually is not just for the military. It's all aspects of the public and private sectors. And basically what it does is it makes the federal government commit to allow religious freedom in every environment. And this is applied to all kinds of things. For example, if a state or city has zoning laws that seem to prohibit the building of a synagogue, but would allow a shopping center under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, that can be attacked as discriminating based on religious practice. And that applies to the military as well, not as completely, but if, for example, the Navy said you can wear head coverings for to show support of the Naval Academy, you can wear, you know, a beanie like this, which has the Naval Academy insignia on it, but you can't wear it for religious purposes. That would violate the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. It doesn't come up much in the military context because it's only of limited application to the military. But the big change came in starting around 2019. And this was when the president issued a regulation, an executive order requiring the military to allow greater religious practice. Now, this is an executive order, which means that one president can revoke it or revise it, but it did filter down. And along with strengthening the allowance of religious practice in general, it encouraged the military branches to change their uniform regulations. So for many service members, beards are allowed again. In most of the services, that applies to chaplains. The Navy, at last time I checked, was still grappling with that as to non-chaplains, but the Army, Air Force, Rabbi Grossman, your father's covered by the United States Army Auxiliary Force, I think is how the Civil Air Patrol is technically called, and it's both Air Force regulations and their own. And essentially, this executive order says that the military must accommodate requests for religious observance, religious practice. The default position is that it's allowed. And in order for it to be restricted, it can't be up to a local commander, a platoon leader, a squadron commander. It has to go to a higher level, typically the General Court Martial Convening Authority, which is typically the general officer who has authority to court martial people, and in certain cases higher. Why is this significant? How does it affect yarmulkes? Well, it changes the perspective of the military. Under Goldman, military necessity comes first, and requests for exception, whether it's yarmulkes, beards, kosher food, time off, there was no special treatment for that. And a company commander, a Captain 03, could say, no, I don't want you to take off for a religious holiday because I need you for this job. This regulation 2019 turned that upside down and said the request will be accommodated. And if the local commander feels that it shouldn't be, he has to kick it upstairs to the equivalent of a general or flag officer. There's certain exceptions in that. And so religious practice is encouraged as a matter of policy, and that hasn't changed. So that would include yarmulkes as well. So whereas in the past, let's say first sergeant might say, well, you can't wear your yarmulke today because we're going into the gas chamber. The first sergeant would have to push a request by a service member to wear a yarmulke up to usually a general officer. And if any of you are veterans there, you know that lower ranking folks like sergeants major don't like to kill their careers by asking the general to do something that just doesn't seem right. So I don't have a lot of reports back from the field, but some of the chaplains who are associated with Olive have reported to me that they know of individual cases where service members have been given much greater leeway, whether it's kosher food, Shabbos observance, Yom Tov, as well as religious wear, yarmulkes, talis katan, and tzitzis that you wear underneath. You can't allow the strings, the actual tzitzis, to hang out of the uniform, but you can wear the talis katan tucked in, because if it's out, it does interfere with the uniform. If it's inside, it doesn't. So that's where we are today. I would tell you, I think the only remaining issue when it comes to yarmulkes that present a challenge is for people who use clips to attach them to their hair. That presents a challenge because you have little teeny metal objects under your official headgear. I think that's probably the one thing I wouldn't know what to tell people about. I would tell them use Velcro as I do. Okay, that's my lecture for today, and I'd love to hear from the audience. I think I can learn a great deal from you. We have some new people there. I see David Novak, Bob Carton, Mark III, and iPhone, Mr. iPhone. So,
Bernie Bromberg.
hi, nice to meet you.
Sorry about that.
Pass it back to you as host. There we have it.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. That's was very enlightening, and it shares a bit of a unique twist on the Jewish experience in the military. So thank you for sharing. And
Yeah, times have really changed. I can remember being ordered to go to church on Sundays, 1981, by General Thurman Anderson in Germany. You will go to church. All officers will go to church on Sundays.
Right.
I said, well, but you don't understand. We have Shabbat services on Friday and Saturday. You still will go to church on Sunday.
At Fort Jackson, South Carolina, just off post, was congregation Beth Shalom, a conservative synagogue, and they had for many, many years a Sunday brunch of bagels and lox for the trainees at Fort Jackson who managed to get transportation on Sunday church services over to the conservative synagogue. They couldn't come on Shabbos, but they could come Sunday morning during chapel time. And I remember the guys in that shul made a big, I mean, they would make thousands of bagels and lox during the week and have them ready, and they loved to have the soldiers come. But it wasn't until Rabbi Hesh Epstein showed up in the 1980s and set up shop in Columbia and the chaplain's training school was eventually moved to Fort Jackson from Fort Monmouth and Fort Hamilton. Anyway, that when they got permission to bring the troops over on Shabbos, that presented a problem because you can't run the buses on Shabbos, so they have the services on post now.
I missed the earlier part of this conversation. I had a conflicting meeting, so I apologize if I'm repeating something you've already said or asking something about something that you didn't get involved in. Is there an increase or a decrease in anti-Semitism in the military today?
Well, I didn't actually discuss that at all, but
Is that beyond the scope of this discussion?
Rabbi Grossman allows it. I'll be glad to comment on it. I don't care.
I'm just Rabbi Grossman Jr. So from my perspective, it's all kosher.
Okay. Well, actually, I know more about this because of my last job before my current one. For about 12 years, I was regional director of the U.S. Department of Education Office for Civil Rights in San Francisco, and we dealt with, amongst other things, we dealt with anti-Semitism on campus. And I had many opportunities to talk with people at ZOA, Morton Klein with Zionist Organization of America, Ken Marcus with the Brandeis Center, and others that dealt with anti-Semitism both on campus and in other environments. And I've been retired for 15 and a half years from the reserves, so I can't tell you with any authority anything new. It really depends who you ask, and how far back you go. I don't think there are good statistics on it. There are a lot of anecdotes, and I don't say that disparagingly, but there are a lot of people who have had personal experiences, either themselves, friends, or relatives, with anti-Semitism in all walks of life, including the military. I would say I would doubt that anti-Semitism in the military is greater now than it was in previous years. And I would point to two reasons for that. Between active and reserve, I was in the military from 1978 to 2006. And really it was a passing of an era. I saw the very last people doing, fulfilling draft commitments in 1978. It was pretty rare. It was mostly doctors that had gotten deferments and did their draft service, because the draft was over by the time I went in. But also people who had been drafted and stayed in. And the amount of anti-Semitism that I experienced both before I became religiously observant and afterwards was fairly negligible, fairly small. And but I dealt with it when I received complaints about it. I was a JAG officer, and one of the problems I had, I don't know if you really call it anti-Semitism, such as somebody who hates Jews, but back in 1980, I was a captain at Fort Jackson in the JAG office, and the senior colonel on post was Colonel Manny Burak, who was DCPA, Department of Community and Public Affairs, I think. And somebody brought it to his attention, and he was Jewish. Somebody brought it to his attention that there was a private Gary Cohn in one of the AIT units, individual training, who had requested time off for Yom Kippur. And his drill sergeant told him that as a result of asking, not only would he not get time off, but he would have to clean the dumpster that day. And he made either an IG complaint or a chaplain's complaint to a Christian chaplain. And somehow it got back to Colonel Burak, and he knew me from our synagogue that we went to, and he asked me to intervene. I ended up, I was a prosecutor then, I wasn't a defense counsel, but I ended up getting Private Cohn off for Yom Kippur. In fact, my wife and I picked him up, drove him to services. I wasn't Shomer Shabbos in those days. There's a lot of stories behind that, but was it anti-Semitism, or was it just a nasty drill sergeant? I'm not certain. I think it could be painted either way. They're not good statistics, and the military has kept track of sexual harassment and out and out racial discrimination and harassment much more than religious harassment, whether against Jews, Muslims, other lesser minority religions in terms of numbers. But I would say from what I hear from soldiers, and you have to really talk to the lower ranking soldiers. You know, I was an officer my entire career, and obviously wouldn't have, people who knew I was an officer wouldn't have been as disrespectful as if I had been a corporal or a private. But since I did spend a lot of time at a basic training base, I would have contact with privates and trainees, as well as reservists. I didn't perceive a lot of anti-Semitism in the military, but the stories I've read from the Vietnam era and World War II suggest that it was more prevalent in those eras, especially World War II. Part of it might have been that the military was 5% Jewish in World War II, and now it's, I don't know, a fraction of a percent.
Thank you.
Somebody's got a question?
Couple of raised hands.
We see a lot more proselytizing now in the military by the I would have to say, not so much Catholics, but by other Christian groups that we've seen in the past. And I based that on, well, I was a national commander of the JWV a year ago, and I was dealing constantly with the military, Religious Freedom Foundation, and a few other groups about these kind of things.
Yeah, proselytizing is a real problem. It's been that way for a long time. The talk about chapel being on Sunday feeds into it. A much higher percentage of the military is populated by fundamentalist Christians than other Christian groups. There are a lot of Catholics, especially with a large Hispanic population that comes into the military. They tend to leave non-Christians alone, but the evangelicals, Pentecostals, much larger numbers than their percentage in society. And then when you look at Reserve and National Guard units, which are geographically based as opposed to nationally in scope, if you have a reserve unit in a place such as a southern state or some other places, you have many more people who proselytize as part of their civilian lives and see nothing wrong with it. So I think there probably is a lot more in the military than in the civilian world, based on that alone. And when somebody shows up who's Jewish, many Jewish service members enlist because they're not connected to family and community. And I'm not meaning that as a criticism. I actually think it's a positive thing rather than seeing them end up on Skid Row. But there are many people who are sort of lost from their home communities and find themselves in the military. Again, I think that's a very positive thing, as opposed to other alternatives. But they're if someone comes from Brooklyn and he ends up working with reservists from North Carolina, there's a good chance that they'll start talking to them about their religious beliefs. Two reasons. One is it's very important to them, and it occupies a lot of their time. And then you have the active proselytization. It's actually prohibited in the military. And chaplains of all denominations and IG are involved, and they're supposed to be involved. And that presents a real challenge for Protestant chaplains, because they have a mission to proselytize, religious mission, but their military mission is to minister to all, including Jewish service members.
Question. I was in medical my military career, and one of my additional duties was MBC NCO. And in there, I'm starting to see, we just recently had a rabbi that had a full beard. And my concern is that I had a hard time getting people without a beard to seal their mask. So do you think they're doing a disservice to themselves, or the military doing a disservice to them if they send them to a combat trans and they have to wear an NBC mask?
Well, it's a big challenge. You know, my reserve unit sent me to NBC school in 1993, and it was a fascinating experience. The only thing I knew about NBC before that was in Command and General Staff College. We had to study it, but it was academic. But I went to a 2-week class in it, and I was clean shaven then. I didn't start growing my beard until I retired. And I always got a good seal. But I know a lot of soldiers really struggled with that. You know, the guy who shaves at 0,500 and by 0,515, he looks like this.
That's me.
And there were a lot of people like that. I think it presents a challenge, and I know that Aleph is dealing with this in individual cases. Now, we know chaplains can be exempt from gas chamber training. And it doesn't just have to do with it has to do with a different role of the chaplains. They don't have to do weapons training, but we always had chaplains that wanted to come with us and fire at the range. I think it's an issue, and it's dealt with successfully by countries that allow beards and have special gas masks. I've had people tell me many times, and I never had the chance to test it myself since I grew this, but that they did get good seals with beards, and they had different methods. They would rub Vaseline on their beards or other stuff. So I don't know, but I think it's a legitimate problem because it is life or death in a combat environment. You're not talking about some kind of training exercise like low crawl. How many times are you going to low crawl away from maybe you will, but if you have to go to a chemical protective suit, could be life or death, God forbid. So I don't know the answer to it, but I think that it's something that hasn't been given enough attention. I'd love to see the military figure out better ways to deal with it.
I've got a different question. That's historical. Well, go ahead, George, finish.
But when you were talking about the Protestant chaplain, we went home for my mother-in-law's funeral, and I would stay at the back of the funeral home at the wake. And my sister-in-law's, she's a teacher for a Baptist or Protestant school, and every day I wore my yarmulke, and every day he came to me and gave me a business card saying, if I ever want to convert, come see him. and I found it funny because, like you said, they have an obligation to do it because that to them is like brownie points. But for us, hey, life goes on. I don't care if anybody becomes a Jew or not. If he's a Jew, then I'm a friend. If he's not, I'm a friend.
You should have suggested whenever he needs a lawyer to call you.
Well, let me turn that question around a little bit. One of the dilemmas for Jewish chaplains is outreach to Jewish service members, and they're Jewish service members who don't want to be reached. It's not proselytizing in the way Christians do, because presumably the soldier, sailor, airman, or marine, or coastie is already Jewish, and that's been discovered. But there have been chaplains who have been questioned on outreach. You know, would you like to put on tefillin? Would you like to have some latkes? How about some bagels and lox? You know, how about schmaltz herring, which would make me vomit, but some people tend to like that. You know, how about have some schmaltz herring? Again, it's not technically proselytizing, but for the chaplain who has an obligation, the Jewish chaplain has an obligation to reach out to Jewish service members and to not only provide for their needs, but to identify their needs. You know, if you come across a Jewish person and you're a chaplain, let's say it's just by coincidence, you're just standing in line next to somebody and they see, oh, you're wearing a yarmulke. And let's say it's a chaplain who shaves. He's not a Lubavitcher or Gerer. He's, you know, young Israel, and he shaves, but he's wearing a yarmulke. And somebody says, oh, are you a rabbi? And the chaplain says, well, yes, I'm Major Cohen, and I'm an Air Force rabbi. Oh, well, I'm Jewish. Or how about, oh, I'm not Jewish, but my mother's mother was Jewish. And the rabbi says, oh, great, here, put on tefillin. Here's some matzah. It presents a very similar challenge, and it's harder to deal with than out and out proselytizing, because if a Christian says to you, here's my card if you want to convert, you say, well, I've been harassed by this chaplain, and they're actually not supposed to do that, you know, for fellow service members. But a Jewish chaplain, it presents similar challenges, even though it's not prohibited per se.
But we do here, we advertise in the community newspaper and the Fort Hood newspaper, Jewish services and everything else. We just recently got a rabbi that just came back from overseas. Now is going to be deployed again. So we're going to be another year or two without a rabbi here. So that's our struggle here, is having a rabbi on the base, because we didn't have one for almost 2 years. We get one in. And now unfortunately for her, she came in from Europe from doing an overseas tour. And Fort Hood, every time you turn around, units are being deployed.
Wow, it's a big.
And she happened to get in a unit that's being deployed next month. And we're going to be short a rabbi for a good year. But we do advertise in a community newspaper and the Fort Hood newspaper. And we have a lay leader taking over the services, and we're going to hopefully get contract rabbis in.
Well, the year I was at Fort Stewart, Georgia, 2003, there was no Jewish chaplain at all the entire time. I wasn't a lay leader. I was there, and I worked with the senior chaplain, who was a Christian colonel. Very interesting guy. He went to his office, and it was set up like a hooch from Vietnam. He had the netting and all kinds of memorabilia, and he played Vietnamese music constantly. He was a fundamentalist Christian, but he was so supportive. He came to me one time. He says, "It's going to be about 2 months until your holiday of Sukkot. Do you want me to order a sukkah?" And he ordered it. He helped us build it. I mean, great guy. And but we did identify a lay leader who was a Sergeant E5, and he deployed. We had the 3rd Infantry Division that was gone most of the time, so we'd have the people who are left at rear area to be court-martialed and boarded out, or permanent party. And so we kept running through lay leaders. So I know the situation you're dealing with, but the Christian chaplains can be very helpful, and they're required to be. But there's only so much they can do. I mean, they can't actually conduct the Jewish service.
Right.
I have a question or a comment. Just there's another side to the whole discussion, and I think it was Brett Oxman, in fact, who first discussed this with me a number of years ago. But it's the question of the Jewish chaplain who winds up having to minister to Christian soldiers or whatever. And he talked about the question in his mind in terms of how could he really relate to them? How does he minister to their spiritual needs, which they have a different perspective of than, for instance, the Jewish soldier. And I think that's a part of the question, the ability, I think, of chaplains to transcend their own individual religion and serve people of other faiths is perhaps unique within the military, and not something typically experienced by your civilian chaplain or civilian lay leaders or religious leaders of one form or another.
Right.
I found Brett's comments really interesting and intriguing. And he's going to talk another day here, but he's a fascinating guy.
No, it's a very interesting issue. It also presents itself in hospitals, some other environments like universities, small colleges maybe that don't have a rabbi available or in town. And the chaplains of all denominations are trained how to minister to service members of other denominations, but it walks a fine line. For example, would a rabbi conduct a Christian service and give communion? Probably not, I would suspect. In fact, I'm being facetious. Of course they wouldn't, but they have to enable the other religious denominations to conduct their services and to support their practices. As I said, this Christian chaplain was very supportive of us. We just went and we bought what we need at Fort Belvoir when I was there as a reservist in the mid-90s. We had an Orthodox Christian chaplain who simply said to me, "We're standing up a new chapel library, and all I have are Woody Allen. A Woody Allen biography is the only Jewish religious text." We tossed that out, and I took him to Lisbon's bookstore in Wheaton, and we bought a bunch of really, Sidurim and other things. They're all pretty basic, but he just said, "Okay, I have, I don't know, a couple $1,000 available for Jewish text. Let's go." And he came with me, and we ate out at a kosher restaurant together. But they are trained and supposed to be able to minister, because the problem arises in many contexts. You know, we as Jews see ourselves as a very small population. There's a critical shortage of Jewish chaplains in all the military branches.
Right.
And the JWB, Jewish Welfare Board, and Aleph are working very closely together to get more and more chaplains into the military. And so I'll give this commercial. If you know of a rabbi who has any interest in serving in the military, please contact Rabbi Grossman. He'll get them in the pipeline to the appropriate credential. That's one of the best ways of dealing with this. Where, but they will learn. What do you do for atheists who want to talk to a chaplain? You can't kick them out and say, well, you don't fit into any of the boxes. The counseling and confidential advice has to be given to all service members, regardless of denomination.
Yeah. Jeffrey, you've been extremely patient with your hand raised for quite a while. Go ahead.
You brought up an interesting point a while back, Art, about World War II. In World War II, 600,000 Jews served in the military, a lot of Jewish chaplains, a lot of Orthodox Jews served in the military in World War II. The events we talked about tonight began in the 1980s. But 40 years prior, when we had all these Jews serving, a lot of them, like Herman Wouk, the famous author, chose to be kind of conformist with the military as far as and I was wondering if you knew of anybody that maybe did wear kippot in World War II, although they tended to wear double coverings with the helmet liner and helmet.
Yeah, so the short answer is, when it comes to kippot, I don't know of personal stories, but I know of them. I know that there were soldiers during World War II who wore yarmulkes because of the ambiguity of the regulations, and sometimes were harassed because of it and were ordered to remove it. And at that time, the military justice system was pretty fast. There were multiple court martials every day, and people were sentenced within days of the offense, including the death penalty. So I'm not saying anybody got the death penalty for refusing to take off a yarmulke, but I'm sure there were a lot of discipline cases. But it points to a very interesting issue, and that is, what do you do when you take people, observant Jews, let's say, and you require them to serve in the military environment, and it causes them to leave their level of observance or practice? I'll take you a few steps further. Take back to World War I. Both of my grandfathers served in World War I in the Russian army. No, I take that back. My father's father was in the Russian army in 1900 to 1903, but my mother's father served in World War I. And I read an article a few months ago about religious observance by Jews in the Russian army in World War I. Of course, my grandfathers are gone a long time ago, so I can't ask them about it. But there was kosher food in the Russian army. There were Jews who wore yarmulkes in the Russian army under their various headgear, always wore talis katan if they wanted to. There were chaplains. There was time off on Shabbos, except during combat. And this was at the time of the Tsar, who wasn't known to be particularly friendly to Jews. But in World War I, the Jewish population of the Russian army approached 20%.
Wow.
And the reason was because Russia was very corrupt. If you were wealthy, you could get out of the draft. If you didn't have connections, if you lived in a shtetl, if you didn't leave Russia, you served. And the enlistments, I think, were 25 years then, if you really got caught up in it. And yet there was wide accommodation for religious practice at that time, which I'm sure was not the case later. So the only story I have is my father, Oliver Sholem. And he was the son of a kosher butcher. And by the time World War II came around, he was not Shomer Shabbos. He didn't wear a yarmulke except the shul, and not very strictly kosher. I mean, he'd eat kosher, he'd eat non-kosher. And so when he went into the army, he ended up on a troop train going across the United States long before he went to Europe and Philippines. And they gave him KP duty. And one of his jobs was to slice bacon. We had never done that before, and he got in trouble because he made it very thick, and you have to make it very thin. And the cook gave him a second. Cook, I don't know what he did with the bacon, but he gave him a second chance. And my father told that story when I was a kid many times, and he usually concluded with, "That's how I learned to enjoy bacon." So, unless I have great love and respect for my father. But I think it points out the dangers of having something like a military where you don't have lay leaders, you don't have Jewish support sufficient to support the service members in their own practices. And of course, they're exposed to all kinds of other things. We can go on and on with the list of them. But it's very easy to lose sight of who you are when you're in an organization that favors uniformity and requires.
But from my understanding, the military's come a long way, because when I was in, I was 74 to 94. And at that time, I was a Christian, not a Jew. And there was really, if you looked at it, there was really nothing healthy there as far as food, breakfast and meals went. It was either a lot of pork. And toward the end of my career, when they came with the Fat Man program, they started coming out these cards, red, yellow, and green. If it was red in your Fat Man program, you couldn't touch it. If it was yellow, it was okay, but green is a must for you. So they're coming a long way, because like I said, I'm only about 5 minutes from Fort Hood. They get kosher MREs in for the troops. And, and I'm glad to see that come along and make that change. Because like I said, when I was in, you had no turkey bacon, chicken sausage. It was either pork.
The food was atrocious. I was, I think I was, it was early in my reserve career when they started to change the menu, but I was astonished in 1978 when I went into the Army, how ancient the menu was even for that time. George, I have to disagree with you on one point. Have you converted?
Yes, I did, 2012.
I have to disagree with you. You've always been Jewish. You just discovered it later.
Well, here's the funny thing. Growing up, I'm a German Jew, okay? And my parents kept telling my mom especially, and my aunts kept saying we were Jewish. But that German pride in me kept denying it. And my two aunts before they passed, and my mom before she passed, gave me information that we were Jewish. So my wife is a Sephardic Jew. She converted too because her family was Jewish and didn't really realize it. So we have an Ashkenazi and a Sephardic Jew that converted in 2012. And then, going strong since then.
But you've been Jewish since Sinai. You just didn't discover it until 2012.
Never looked at it that way.
Moses didn't have kippot at Sinai. The only requirement was to kick off your sandals.
But what's interesting, coming out of the Christian religion and hearing you talk about it and being Jewish and seeing the difference, and having the background there, I can understand where you're coming from, where we have to go out and save the world and give them Jesus. Where in Judaism, we don't.
I think many Jews fail to understand the religious imperative of proselytization. It's not just join my club, I want you to be like me. It's really a significant part of Christian teaching. And I say that with full respect, even though over the years I have been approached by people who are more crude about it, but really most of them, it's a sincerely held religious belief that redemption comes with people accepting the Christian religion. And if but since I understood that, it doesn't trouble me. I lived most of my life in the Carolinas, and people would talk to me about Christianity. Well, why don't you accept our religion? After all, our leader was a Jewish shepherd, or whatever. And I don't take. It's been a long time since I took offense at that. Once I realized it's a seriously held religious belief, but we have to be strong in who we are and how we respond to it. Again, so long as it's not oppressive, like, at gunpoint or something. But all the years I lived in the Carolinas, I respected people who felt that way, and they respected me once they understood that my belief was sincere. And so a lot of Jews are very difficult. There's this guy, Mickey Weinstein, with the anti-Jewish, anti-religious group. I forget what it's called, Freedom from Religion.
Military Religious Freedom Foundation.
Right.
He gets a little carried away, Mickey Weinstein, but
He does.
Well,
Yeah. So the problem I have is that it's anti-religious practice. And I think one of the things that has made America such a strong democracy and place to live is not just tolerating religion, but the fact that we have people who are sincerely religious, even if they're different from us.
Mhm.
Who else has a comment? I want to hear from everybody. We got a small group.
I have somewhat of a humorous incident myself, not having been in the military, although everyone here knows my father. I attended a Boy Scout jamboree at Fort AP Hill a number of years back. I was working with the Jewish Children's Organization, and we were going to be spending the jamboree. We were going to be spending Shabbat at the jamboree on Fort AP Hill, and along with an entire Shomer Shabbat contingent, a Shabbat observant contingent. And of course, one thing that would be necessary to make such a thing happen would be an Eruv, a surrounding fence, which doesn't need to be picket or chain link. It could be a number of poles with a string attached, enabling one to carry within the Shabbat law in that containment. Now, usually when you see an Eruv, you see it as one unit. Well, the engineers at Fort AP Hill saw each individual pole as its own edifice, and they had to take out a permit for each and every pole.
On a smaller level, when I was at Fort Stewart, there was a religiously observant private in the Army. He had been a lieutenant in the Air Force, and after ROTC, and for some reason, and he got out of the military and he came back in and made him a private. I think he was a PFC by the time I met him. Very nice guy. He went out to the field over Shabbos, Sukkot, and he made an Eruv with string and 2 Humvees and some sticks and a sukkah. And he had a sukkah that went over a door and the 2 doors and the body of a Humvee, the 2 open doors. Very creative, but he was tall. I mean, this guy was well over 6 feet. And, the Humvee is not as tall as he was. Maybe I could fit under it. I'm pretty short. But I said, well, how'd you deal with it? He said, I just put a little chair in it and sat down when I went in to have a meal in the sukkah. So he had an Eruv and a sukkah and completed his field training exercise.
That's creative. I'm sure that Hashem has a special joy from the creativity that the Jews in the military have in keeping with Jewish practice. Bernie, is that your hand raised?
That's me, yeah. This is one experience. I was in the Navy from 72 to 78, and I've told Rabbi Grossman, your father, Rabbi Grossman, about my experiences then. And back in the 70s, I think it was to some extent, I wasn't raised religiously. But culturally, to some extent, the only culture I really kept was not mixing flesh, chicken, and dairy. Who knows? I knew not to do that, but My stepfather ate ham, and I partook in some when I was a child, also younger. But in any event, when I went in the Navy in boot camp, of course, it was mandatory on Shabbos that we go to shul. This is an NTC Naval Training Center in San Diego, which is a huge facility, and there were a few Jews there. Not that many that I saw, but we were compelled to go to. So we had to go to. So that was my first experience with regular attendance. After that, not so much, because most of my service was on naval vessels, either small destroyers or the submarine. Not too many crew members to begin with, and hardly any Jews. So I didn't participate that much in that. But there was one case when I was stationed in electronics radar school in San Francisco. There were several bad military facilities. This is back in the 70s around Vietnam time. So there were several naval facilities around there. I think there was Naval Air Station, I think, back in Oakland, and a few other facilities and schools. So Passover came, and when I had not celebrated Passover. I knew about Passover, but never celebrated it. But the Jewish Community Center in San Francisco had made arrangements. How they did this, I'm not sure, but I guess they met through the military, got permission to send out buses to pick up various Jewish servicemen and bring them to a mass seder, a large seder at the Jewish Community Center in San Francisco. Of course, going on buses, they weren't that so, they were that observant, but there's only way to get us together. So they did that, and that was my first Passover Seder. I learned about the Seder play and the various offerings on it. And so I told your father, I said, the Navy, the Navy, not so much the Navy, but the community, the civilian community in that area went I think, to the extraordinary length to help the Jewish servicemen. So I think that's another resource you can sometimes look to, especially if you're stationed somewhere where there's a large facility or an active community. They can sometimes, because I know the USO, I got a lot of help from the USO, more than I did the Jewish community, but in that particular instance, it was like almost a Jewish USO. So they took us to the Seder. So I just want to point that out. So that's something that maybe people can think of as an additional resource. That's all I have to say.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Dave?
Yes, hi. I'm curious to know that does JAG work with any local authorities when somebody from the military, say they have their yarmulke on and they're on leave and there's problems within the civilian area?
Yeah, so the way it would work, well, it depends how it comes up. So if a serviceman or woman has a problem off post, whatever it is, then they're a combination of agencies on the military base that deal with it, and it depends what it is. Typically, if it's a religious problem, well, let me back up. If it's a problem of a personal nature, whatever it is, whether somebody's being ripped off by a local merchant, the old thing was that the encyclopedia salesman would come on post and sell these privates who had a wall locker and a trunk, an encyclopedia. That's when we used to have encyclopedias. But if it's a consumer issue or some other thing like that, then JAG would get involved. In terms of some kind of harassment, if there are civilians who are harassing the military, so this is where this goes not to JAG, this goes to the commander. And the commander has people who are liaisons with the civilian community. This is very, very important. In a lot of cities, the city itself, whether it's Fayetteville, North Carolina, Columbia, South Carolina, Columbus, Georgia, Dothan, Alabama, the cities themselves have liaisons in either the mayor's office or the city administrator's office that immediately get involved. It's a joint committee between the civilian and military, and they try to figure it out and find out whether it's having police investigate, if it's something serious, if it's something, a serious nature, or just some kind of general annoying behavior. and they spring into action. The problem is when you have a military base in a town or city, or maybe a rural area that doesn't have that kind of relationship with the military. And then the military itself is supposed to deal with it, but they have limited authority. I mean, you know, you can't go arrest somebody off the installation who has harassed a member of the military. Technically, you could send the FBI because it's an assault on a federal official, but it's usually off duty. If you had a service member who was, let's say, driving a military vehicle to a meeting, that would be federal. So usually JAG doesn't come into it. However, if the service member makes an appointment with JAG and says, hey, I've been harassed when I'm off post, then we do get involved. It's normally not a command referral because they have a civilian military liaison at every military base, whether it's just the local farmers, if it's rural, or, you know, if it's Fort Hamilton. I'm sure they have a giant bureaucracy with New York City and the boroughs, but they're required under Department of Defense regulations to have this sort of committee that will deal with problems of civilian area. One of the areas that usually comes up is if a service member is involved in an auto accident, even in his own vehicle, if it's drunk driving, the communities always assume that this is something that no civilian would ever do. It's just, you know, the soldier or sailor got drunk, went downtown and had an accident, and then it doesn't happen except when military is involved. So that's something that's dealt with right away. Oh, let me just add, any kind of housing discrimination, though, the military will deal with, and JAG will get involved. It's not representing the soldier, it's actually representing the command. The JAG Corps is required to investigate allegations of discrimination against service members. Typically, it's going to be not renting apartments or houses to service members, but it could also be for religious or racial reasons.
When JAG gets involved in, I'm sorry, David, you had your hand up. I didn't interrupt.
No, I just asked the question. Thank you.
Oh, when JAG gets involved, does JAG represent the commander, the military person who's involved in it, or is the commander always the prosecutor, so to speak, the complainant, as it were?
Well, so JAG in all of the branches has many different divisions. There are the trial counsel who prosecute courts-martial and will be involved in administratively separating service members who are accused of misconduct. And then there are the defense counsel who defend service members who are accused of misconduct. But there are two other areas as well. One is legal assistance. So this is the JAG officer who represents the service member that buys a used car where the odometer has been rolled back, or has a landlord that tries to evict him even though he's paid his rent. When it comes to community relations, you have the administrative law section. In the administrative law section, in a small JAG office, you know, one officer may wear 3 or 4 hats, not prosecution and defense at the same time, but various others. It's the administrative law section that represents and advises the command. So let's say you have a situation where soldiers are being kicked out of restaurants by somebody who doesn't like the military. The administrative law section will advise the command and represent the command. Legal assistance may represent the individual service members who are having problems. So there'll be 2 different lawyers and they may work together. And in some cases, it may be the same lawyer who's wearing both hats because it's really not a conflict if there's no discipline involved. But the administrative lawyer handles all the administrative law for the command, and that would be government contracts, that would be environmental law, that would be relations with state agencies. And in my career, I did all of those things. But When it comes to relations with the community, that's administrative law. When it comes to individual soldiers' conflict with civilians, that's legal assistance. But they all come under the JAG office.
Thank you.
I was in your sister unit up in Savannah, Georgia. And when I left, I understood Schwarzkopf closed Hinesville down because of rental problems. But going back to the police, you and I could come out of a bar, me and my military haircut, and the partner with me got his long hair bouncing off the walls. We both drive off, going the same direction. And from my understanding, the military, paid for a new police station in Hinesville back in the 80s.
That wouldn't surprise me. When I was in Fort Stewart, I remember seeing they had a pretty nice looking police station there. But you know, I'm old enough to remember in the 1970s that the only young men who had short hair were in the military. It became more stylish. Now you can't really tell just by looking at them.
I have another question. If somebody practicing religion, a soldier, he comes in, and he's having issues with it, does JAG ever get involved with medical services for counseling or anything? Or they just refer the person to perhaps, go to that route?
Well, it depends. If part of it is a conflict with a supervisor, whether civilian supervisor or military, JAG might be involved. JAG officers provide a limited amount of counseling. It's counseling in relation to a legal matter. If it's not legal, let's say a service member is just having difficulty resolving his own internal questions, trying to decide whether to stay in the military or resign in terms of an officer or not re-enlist in terms of an enlisted man. It's unlikely that a JAG officer would be involved, but there's nothing to prohibit that, especially in the legal assistance field. When I did that, I did a lot of everything in different areas, but when I did legal assistance, service members would come in with some very peculiar questions that didn't necessarily involve the law. Having trouble with my mother-in-law, what can I do about it? Well, unless they wanted to kill her, it wasn't a legal issue. But if the soldier was in my office, I would chat with him about him and try to give him suggestions. And most JAG officers do that, but they're not really required if they don't identify a legal issue. And by the way, you can't provide psychological counseling or much in the way of religious counseling. So it would be incumbent on a JAG officer to get that person to the right help as well.
Any other comments or thoughts that someone would like to
Thank you
share?
very much for hosting us, and thank you for guest lecturing.
Thank you, Jeffrey, and everyone else. I've really enjoyed it. I told Rabbi David Grossman that I might try to do another one later in the summer, but I don't know much about anything. So you've hit the one spot that I've actually done some research on. But I enjoy this, and I hope that, as I said, you'll encourage people to go into the military. Those of you who have any kind of military connection or background, it really, I think it helped me eventually become religiously observant because it taught me a lot of self that I didn't have when I was younger. I mean, I wasn't a troublemaker or anything, but I was sort of goofy like most teenagers. But I think that I encourage Jews to serve in the military. It's something we owe the country, which has provided such enormous haven and support for our religious practice and even just place to live, even if we're not religiously observant. And then get those rabbis to sign up and become chaplains. We're really, really short of Jewish chaplains. And it really goes so far because they play a very prominent role in in the lives of Jews and non-Jews, where they see examples of observant Jews, and it's not just, you know, the Hollywood stereotype of the nebbish or whatever it is.
I have a question about that. When there's a shortage of rabbis, if the shortage in any given area is acute, and it comes time for Shabbos, and there's to be a service, but there's no rabbi, since we, after all, are a nation of priests, and we have all kinds of people who can do the service and do it automatically on the Shabbos. Do they ever step up? Are they in the military? Do
Yeah,
they
there's a
ever
whole lay
step
leader
up?
program. Jewish Welfare Board has a lay leader program, and I'm sure the, what do you call it? What do you call it? The Olive has it also.
Yeah, there's a big lay leader program. But even beyond that, I met people who were either currently or formerly religiously observant in my career who could step up and run a service, and they surprised me. There was a doctor, I don't want to give his name because I don't want to embarrass him, but he wasn't religious at all. He was living in Mississippi, and he got mobilized. He was a colonel, and he was passing through Fort Stewart, Georgia, while I was there. He was on his way over to Afghanistan with a medical unit. And I usually didn't stay in town on Shabbos. I was given an accommodation. I only lived 6 hours away, as I could go home most times on Shabbos, not every time. And there was one time that I was at Fort Stewart, and this colonel happened to be there. And he said, what are you going to, and he found out I was going to be stuck in my room for Shabbos. And he said, what are you doing for Shabbos? And I said, just in my room. We didn't have an organized service or anything. I had Siddurim, I had food, and had what I needed. And he was in the National Guard barracks about a mile away. No air conditioning, it was the heat of the summer. And he said, and he was a full colonel, I was a lieutenant colonel. He said, can I come over and daven with you? And I was just really struck. It was beautiful. And I said, of course. And sure enough, he showed up and spent the day with me, and he davened much better than I did. And, you know, no indication of his ever being observant. He told me that he grew up conservative, but had gotten away from it, and he could conduct the service. So, Bob, to answer your question, I think we have a lot of
What?
diamonds in the rough, and we should take advantage of them.
But isn't it hard to get into the lay leader services, the course?
That I don't know. I'm not familiar with it, but Rabbi David Grossman can get information, and those of you who are lay leaders. You know, I don't have any official connections anymore, but Aleph and the Jewish Welfare Board have programs to recruit and train lay leaders, and they're very good at it, but you also can encourage people to make those connections.
Okay.
Somebody can be an informal lay leader. If they have the skill, you know, I'm sure nobody would turn anyone down who wants to help out.
Jerry, go ahead.
I can answer George's question because I've been a lay leader several times. It's actually very easy. You have to get usually JWB or Aleph to help you with your accreditation. Your commander has to sign off on it.
I'm not active anymore.
Right, but
And your wife has to sign off on it.
Oh, no. No problem.
Rabbi-
For her.
I usually did mine in Afghanistan and other countries. It's not that hard, but you have to understand you deal with consensus.
Mhm, right.
And you have to really, you have to go for a very vanilla service. A good example, I was in Afghanistan. I was moving around. I'm a PAO, so I do travel. And there was a helicopter pilot. He and I shared the lay leader duties. And he was a very observant individual. And one of the female doctors had wanted to say Yortzeit, and he refused. He said, "We don't have 10 men. I'm not doing it."
Right.
I said, "I understand that, but it's really not your call. She wants to do it, and you need to understand, we are lucky if we have 10 Jews here, let alone 10 men. So,
Right.
Captain, you don't have to say anything, by all means. Not trying to go against your wishes, but you can't say no as a lay leader. You have to accommodate." I don't feel comfortable. So I said, "Fine, I'll do it."
Well, we got a very diverse group at Fort Hood, very diverse.
I know the last time I was at Hood a few years ago coming home, there was a rabbi around. He's probably gone.
Hold on.
Yeah.
Hold on.
But you can always, ask to help.
Right.
Well, thank you very much, everyone, for participating. Thank you, Lieutenant Colonel Zeidman, for your sharing, your openness.
Thank you all. And Rabbi, please give my regards to your father, and everyone have a good evening and carry out the remainder. Yesterday was one of the Army's birthdays and Flag Day. I don't know how.
Happy birthday to the Army.
Happy birthday to the Army.
Hooah!
Hoorah.
And you all come back.
Greens, yeah. Been a pleasure. Everybody be good.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, sir.
Have